Welcome to America and Arizona Government for Elementary Teachers. This is Presentation 16, Public Opinion and Socialization. For most of our country's history, politicians had to guess what public opinion was. They did this by listening to public opinion leaders like newspaper editors or popular clergy or the local party boss. If you remember the discussion on the legislature in Presentation 7, there were two types of legislature, two views of what a legislature's job was, a delegate and a trustee. Now, if a legislature wanted to follow the delegate model, this was a big problem. If you're not able to ascertain what your constituency wants, how can you act as a delegate and do what they would have you do? Now, modern social science has addressed this issue by coming up with scientific methods to accurately assess public opinion. Now, this has now led to the opposite problem, which some people accuse politicians of having no center, no principles, and only following the winds of public opinion. In this lecture, we'll look at how public opinion is measured. We'll then examine where that opinion comes from by looking at the process of political socialization. This presentation examines AEPA Objective 15, Understand the Role of Political Culture, Public Opinion, and the Media in United States Politics. It also looks at Concept 4, Rights, Responsibilities, and Roles of Citizenship in the Arizona Social Studies Standard, Strand 3, Civics and Government. I again urge you to look at the Social Studies Standard articulated by grade level document for Strand 3 and look at the objectives that are listed there under Concept 4. As we finish this presentation, go back and review this document and make sure that you understand and have acquired a competent basis for those objectives. We start with the question, what do voters base their votes on? What makes them behave the way that they do? Where do these opinions come from? Do voters vote on ideology? Do they vote on self-interest? Is it random, meaning you win an election because you're lucky that day? We need to be able to do more than guess at what the answers to these questions are in order to truly understand American politics. There is a whole subdiscipline of American politics that looks solely at voting behavior. So there is quite a bit known now about why people vote the way that they do. A good place to start is to look at Philip Converse's study of political behavior from the 1960s. Converse was a political scientist who struggled with these questions of why people voted the way that they did. So he asked a representative sample from the nation lots of questions, and through these questions he tried to determine why they had voted the way they had in the previous election. Now, what he found was rather troubling. He found that only 2.5% of the people he interviewed could base their vote on ideology, meaning they voted for a Republican because they agreed with Republicans' worldview, or they voted for a Democrat because they agreed with the Democrats' political positions. Only 2.5% could associate the vote they cast with their political ideology, their political belief system. Now, this is a bit troubling because prior to that time, most political scientists assumed that the reason democracy worked is because the party that had the ideology that matched the electorate was the party that won. Remember, the government legitimacy is based on the consent of the governed. Well, if the people aren't really voting based on their political ideology, what are they voting on? What Converse found was that the largest group of voters were voting based on group interest, not ideology. What this meant was that old people voted for candidates who promised large Social Security checks, and farmers voted for the person who promised a new farm bill and large subsidies for corn. They were voting out of their pocketbook, basically, not out of any political ideology. Other groups voted for different reasons that were not political either. Almost a fourth of them voted based on the nature of the times, meaning if things were going really well and there was peace and prosperity, they voted for the incumbent. If there was a recession or there was a war or they just felt a degree of angst about things, they voted against the incumbent and voted for the challenger. So the overall nature of the times determined their vote, not any political ideology. About a fourth of the electorate couldn't really explain why they voted, which again was troubling. They had no political attitudes at all. They would ask, why did you vote for that person? And they would say, I don't know. Or they might say, because he looks better, he makes me laugh, he's younger, his jingle was catchy in my ear, and I remembered it when I was voting. You know, there are reasons that a political theorist would be aghast at for why people are voting, because they have no bearing on the issues or political parties or ideologies of the day. These people were essentially randomly voting when they walked into the booth. And then, perhaps even more disturbing or troubling, almost 10% of the electorate were what Converse called near ideologues. And what he meant by that term was these were people who understood only a slogan version of their political party, that they didn't really understand the politics, they didn't really understand the philosophy, but they would parrot back slogans or phrases that they had heard over and over again and give those as reasons for why they vote. What Converse found, though, was the near ideologues, the people who only gave a slogan version, often voted opposite of what the actual ideology was of the candidate they were voting for. So their misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the political ideology led them to vote in a manner opposite to what they thought they were voting for. And that was almost 10% of the electorate. So, put together, this presented a rather troubling view of the American electorate. This led Converse and other political scientists to ask the troubling question of, does democracy even work if only a tiny percentage of the electorate actually know what they're doing and understand the political issues of the day and the political ideology of the party that they're voting for? How can democracy work if they're not basing their actions on that? Now remember, this is in the 1960s, during the Cold War, and when America was trying to convince other parts of the world that democracy was a pretty good thing. Well, if you contrast democracy with communism or a military totalitarianism, it's hard to really justify democracy if the people who are electing candidates are frankly idiots who don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it. How can democracy work? So that was the question that led political scientists to try to resolve this puzzle of how can democracy work if the voters are clueless and don't know what they're doing? The first answer to that question is the idea of information shortcuts. And what this means is that it's okay that not every American knows every single policy detail of the person they're voting for. You can imagine sort of a policy wonk in a think tank devoting their life to tracking every debate that goes through society, or a writer for one of these political talk shows that constantly knows who did what, when, where, and why. Well, most Americans simply don't have the time or interest to track politics in that level of detail. And the argument is that that's okay, because party preference in particular, but other indicators, can be used as a shortcut so that voters can behave rationally even if they don't fully understand the issues at hand. So, if I am at a voting booth and I have a long ballot, it's a presidential ballot, so I have the president and a senator and the governor and a House representative and all of the state legislature and my local mayor and the city council and the corporation commission and the mine inspector, and then there's 35 propositions. That's a long ballot. And can I really take the time to educate myself on every single one of those issues? Well, what I could do is I could just say, hey, I'm a Democrat, and because I'm a Democrat, I have a certain set of beliefs about what the role of government is in society. And this person who's running as the mine inspector is a Democrat and is running against a Republican. I don't know anything about this race. I don't know anything about these people. But I can make an assumption. I can take a shortcut on my information gathering and assume that this Democratic candidate for mine inspector is going to more closely associate with my values and opinions. Or maybe I'm a Republican and I'm going down the list of candidates, and there are Republican candidates for Corporation Commission, and I don't know anything about that race. In fact, I'm like most Arizonans, and I don't even know what the Corporation Commission does or why they're on the ballot. But I do know, as a Republican, that a fellow Republican is probably going to behave in ways that I agree with more often than a Democrat, and so I'm going to vote Republican. So those are the kinds of information shortcuts that an electorate can go through, that even though the electorate is rather clueless on most of the issues out there, they can still make an informed, rational choice. So this is one answer that was given to the problem that Converse presented. A different answer, and perhaps a more compelling one, is the miracle of aggregation. And this is an answer that Converse himself came up with to answer his own question of how can democratic theory justify a democracy if the majority of voters are clueless and don't know what they're doing. What he pointed out is that on a distribution curve, most of these curves are bell curves. And the distribution curve at issue here is how firmly does someone feel about their particular political party. So here we have a curve with the reds versus the blues, with the undecideds in the middle here. And on this curve we have the extremes on the left are the extreme reds. These are people who couldn't contemplate voting for a blue. We'll go ahead and say the reds are Republicans and the blues are Democrats. That seems to be a popular way to do it. So these Republicans would never in their life vote for a Democrat. They would rather not vote than vote for a Democrat. And likewise, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the hardcore Democrats. And they can't think of voting for a Republican. An example of this would be in the 2000 election in Missouri, where Tom Ridge was running for senator against a Democrat, and the Democrat died in a plane crash while he was campaigning. And it was too late to change the ballot for a different Democratic candidate. It was too late to even put a candidate in to file. And so Missouri went ahead with the election and ran Tom Ridge against the dead senator. And the dead senator won because there were so many Democrats in Missouri who would rather vote for a dead man than a Republican that Tom Ridge lost. Now, the deceased senator's wife was appointed by the governor to fill that senator's term. But the point that I'm making is that the people on the extreme ends are diehard advocates, partisans of their party. And then moving closer to the middle, on each side you have leaners. These are people who identify with their party. If you ask them, they'll say, well, yes, I'm a Republican, or of course I'm a Democrat. And 80% of the time on any given election, they'll vote for their political party. But they can be persuaded. They'll occasionally cross over and vote for an individual on the other party who has captured their attention. Or maybe they simply don't like the candidate of their party in a particular race, and so they'll vote for the other party. So they can usually be counted on, but not consistently. So they're leaners. And then in the middle we have the undecideds, the people who, as Converse found, are voting purely out of their pocketbook, or they don't know why they're voting, or maybe you've got some genuine ambivalent people who've educated themselves on the issues and can see both sides, so they're in the middle there. Now, what Converse argued is that on any given election, this is what the distribution of voters tends to look like. Most of the people are in the middle, undecided or clueless. Then you've got a significant amount of leaners on either side, and then a smaller group of hardcore partisans. Now, the reason why democracy can work here is because those people in the middle, the majority of the candidates, are undecided. They're essentially randomly voting. Now, if you were to flip a coin 100 times, how many times is it going to come up heads? Well, assuming nobody has fiddled with the coin, it's going to come up heads about 50% of the time, and give or take a couple. Likewise, it'll come up tails 50% of the time, give or take a couple. And so what Converse argued is that these undecideds who are making up their mind the morning before they walk into the voting booth are essentially canceling each other out, which makes them irrelevant to the outcome because they don't contribute to one side's victory over the other. As those random votes wash out against each other. Sometimes it's head, sometimes it's tails, but it's going to work about 50-50. What that means is that the side that wins the election is the side that either gets their committed people to come to vote more than the other side does, or it's a side that is able to persuade some of the other side's leaners to cross over and vote for them. Which means whichever candidate runs the best campaign has more votes consistently for them from the leaners and partisans than the other side that had an ineffective campaign, whose partisans maybe didn't show up and whose leaners defected and voted on the other side. Which means because of the miracle of aggregation, meaning each individual voter may not be able to give you a coherent reason why they're voting, but when you add all those voters together, you aggregate the outcome, the undecideds cancel each other out, the idiots cancel each other out, and the best campaign wins, which means democracy works. And so that's why it's the miracle of aggregation. The miracle is that it turns an electorate that is somewhat clueless on the whole and turns it into a body of voters that actually makes a rational choice consistent with democratic theory. So, Converse ends up saving us from his own quandary. So let's turn our attention then to where do these opinions come from, now that we know the impact they might have on elections. Now, opinions are emotional in character. We like to think when we have policy debates that the side who can bring the best argument and the most reasoned argument to the table wins. That typically is not the case. And if you've ever seen two people arguing about politics, what you'll quickly see is that unless it's a structured debate, reason quickly takes a backseat to emotion. And that's because our opinions are not simply rational cognitive constructs. Those opinions, the way our memory works is we have two synapses in our brain, and there's a connection between them. That's how memory or an opinion is formed, that this concept is associated with that concept, and that's how we form that opinion or memory. But in addition to that connection being made, the strength of that connection can determine the intensity of the feeling that is there. So it's not enough to simply ask what someone's opinion is. It's necessary to ask how strongly they hold that opinion. Now, the problem with measuring those types of emotionally laden opinions is the issue of social norms. Now, a social norm is an expectation of behavior. It's not written down, it's not a law, but everyone knows what it is. And these are things like opening doors for people, or when you walk on an elevator, you're supposed to stand in a corner and turn around and face the front and look at the numbers. If someone were to walk into an elevator and stand right next to you and look at you instead of turning and looking at the numbers, you're going to become very uncomfortable because the social norm has just been violated. And you will likely be nervous because if someone is violating the social norm of where to look on an elevator, they might start violating other social norms. And that might involve touching, and you don't want any part of that. So you're going to run and hit whatever the next floor is and get the heck off that elevator. So we are surrounded by social norms. We understand what those norms are, and we may or may not abide by those norms, but we know what they are. Now, this creates a problem with measuring opinions. So if I were to call someone and ask them whether or not they think that a deadbeat dad should pay child support, there is a correct answer to that question. And most people know what the correct answer is. And so there is a social pressure to answer that question in accordance with the social norm. Likewise, if I go to a Republican Party convention and I start talking to people about gun control, there may be someone in the audience, maybe they've had a relative killed in gun violence and they're in favor of gun control. But if I'm ask that person in front of all of their peers at this NRA convention what they think about gun control, odds are they're not going to tell me what they really think. They're going to tell me what they expect their peers to want them to say. So that complicates measuring public opinions, particularly if you're doing a survey, if over the phone or in person. The social scientists who early tried to measure public opinion, one solution they had to the problem of social norms was to rely on what was called the bogus pipeline. And what that meant is they tried to convince the survey respondent that they had a pipeline into their mind. So you do that by bringing them into a room, and the social scientist is wearing a white lab coat, and they sit them on a chair and hook a bunch of wires up to their forehead, and there's a machine nearby with some indicators, and they say, okay, you're hooked up to a lie detector test, and we know if you're not telling us what you really think. So while you're hooked up to this machine, I'm going to ask you some questions. And the machine might not even be plugged in. There is no such machine that can detect lies. Even lie detectors only work if you think they work. So that kind of a pipeline, bogus pipeline, was used in the 50s and 60s, but people are a little more savvy these days, and so those kinds of tricks have stopped working long ago. A better solution than a bogus pipeline is to construct a survey in accordance with social science principles of survey construction. Since the 50s and 60s, we've figured out how to minimize the errors that are in surveys. Now, it's impossible to eliminate errors because people are not molecules. They behave in different ways. The same person might answer a question differently if you ask them on Friday and then ask them again the following Wednesday. You might get a completely different answer. So you're never going to eliminate error in measuring public opinion. But what you can do is you can eliminate the non-random errors. What that means is there a bias in your survey instrument? So going back to the coin flipping, if I'm flipping a coin 100 times, it's going to come up heads about 50 times. Unless I weigh the coin, if I put a layer of glue on one side, on the tails side, now if I flip it, it's going to land heads up more often than it would have if it had not been a weighted coin. And so I'm going to get 60 or 65 heads instead of 50. Similarly, if a survey instrument is not designed correctly, the questions may elicit a certain response, and that bias that results introduces a non-random error. It's an error that's in a consistent direction. And so what professional scientific survey construction is about is constructing it to eliminate as many of these non-random errors as possible so that the surveyor can get the most accurate picture possible. The four elements of scientific survey construction is a representative sample, control for interviewer effects, control for question wording, and control for question order. Let's look at each of these in turn. The first and probably most important element of survey design is to guarantee that you have a random representative sample. And so let's look at that in more detail. The first requirement is that it be a representative sample. If you're going to question a group of people and you expect to be able to say something about a larger population, then the people you question need to look, act, and think like the larger population does. So, for example, if I question the individuals pictured in the slide and I ask them about their opinion in music tastes, I'm going to get an answer that probably is not reflective or representative of the nation as a whole, because they belong to a particular subset of the population. I would need to go out of my way to select individuals that are more likely to be representative. Now, that doesn't mean I would ignore those individuals pictured in the slide, because their opinion matters and their viewpoints on music are part of the larger picture of American musical tastes. But I would want to expand my sample beyond those two individuals. The way to do that is to engage in a random selection. This means that I don't want to pick people in one place. I want to pick people who are randomly located around the area in order to get the widest sample possible. For example, if I want to know who is going to vote for Governor Brewer versus Terry Goddard in the 2010 gubernatorial race, well, I could go to ASU and stand on the Commons area and by the fountain there and just ask everybody there, who are you going to vote for? And I could get a result and calculate my result, and maybe I have 60% going for Goddard and 40% for Brewer. And I then announce to the world that 60% of Arizonans are in favor of Goddard, and I'm going to predict that he would win. Were I to do that, I would be committing a fairly significant error here, because the students who are hanging out around the fountain at ASU are not representative of the state of Arizona. So I could say, well, maybe I don't want to talk about the people of Arizona, I'm just talking about ASU students. Well, even then, the people who are hanging out around the fountain are not necessarily representative of ASU students. So you could say, well, maybe I should have a random sample. And so I'm going to ask every 10th person who walks out the door of the student center this question. Well, now we're getting better because it's a random sample, but even that is not representative, because not all ASU students go to the student center. In fact, there's some students who never go on campus at all. So maybe I wanted to phone interview so I could get a listing of all ASU students, and I could go down that list, and every 20th person on that list I could call and ask them that question. Well, now I'm getting really close to a random and representative sample, because now all ASU students have a reasonably equal chance of being selected for that question. So that's the key to ask, is, has this survey that you're looking at a result from a random representative sample? Now, if you want to conduct a survey and extrapolate the results to the entire nation, then what they found is that you typically need to ask a little over 3,000 people. And if those 3,000, 3,200, maybe 3,500 people are truly randomly sampled, then the answers you get from those people are going to accurately reflect the outcome as if you had asked 30,000 people. The percentage results are not going to shift very much from 3,000 to 30,000. There is a mathematical equation that survey constructors use to determine how representative their sample is, and that is reported as a sampling error, and you will see a survey that will say Goddard is ahead of Brewer by 10 points, plus or minus 2 points are the margin of error. That margin of error is what tells you how large of a sample was drawn relative to the population that it's being extrapolated to. And if that margin of error is greater than 3, then that means that whatever survey you're looking at should really only be used for entertainment purposes only. If it's greater than 3, you really don't have a lot of confidence that the sample was representative, because that means that they stopped asking people before they reached the number of people that they should have to get below a plus or minus 3. So that's one test as a consumer of surveys over whether it's a good survey or not. The next potential area for error, for non-random error, is interviewer effects. What this is referring to is that the problem of social norms can rear its ugly head more easily if the interviewer behaves in ways that give off nonverbal clues as to what the correct answer is supposed to be. In effect, the interviewer influences the outcome of the survey, even if the interviewer is not trying to. Just the fact of who they are and how they present themselves can alter the outcome of the question. There was one case study done on this where they asked a representative sample whether they agreed with policies that would promote affirmative action. And they had a white person asking the question and an African American asking the question. And there was a marked difference between those two respondents over whether or not they reported that they supported affirmative action. And that finding held true even when the conversation took place over the phone, so that race was not an obvious distinction. It was still obvious enough to the person on the other end of the line that they could tell the race of the person asking the question. And even though the question was the exact same and the way the question was asked was the exact same, the outcome varied dramatically based on who was asking the question. So, on this slide here, if the woman walking around asking people on a door-to-door survey brings her child with her, and the survey is whether or not they're going to vote for the next bond election to pay for the neighborhood grade school, her presence, the presence of the child with her, is going to alter the outcome of the respondents that she gets. This would introduce that non-random error and would invalidate the survey. So, as a consumer of surveys, it's always good to ask yourself, who asked this question? And did they have an impact, an effect on the way that question was asked? The next issue that can introduce bias into a survey is the way the questions are worded. The way you ask a question can largely determine the answer to the question that you get. For instance, if I were to ask whether divorced men who are unemployed should have their wages garnished when they do get a job to make up for their outstanding child support payments, I would get one answer. But if I were to ask whether deadbeat dads should support their kids, I would get an entirely different answer. So we have to be careful that the wordings of our question don't bring a presupposed outcome to that survey. The NRA is always a good example of this. One of their surveys is pictured on the slide there. I remember receiving a questionnaire from the NRA during the 2004 election, and the question was, do you support Senator Kerry and his agenda to put radical activist judges on the Supreme Court who will ban personal use of firearms? Or do you support President Bush, who will nominate judges who respect the Constitution? Right. Well, there's clearly a correct answer being solicited for that question, which brings me to point out why question wording can be used. The NRA is smart enough to know that they're not generating an accurate survey with that survey. That's not the purpose of that NRA survey. That survey is what is called a push poll. Now, a push poll serves one of two functions. One is the questions are worded in such a biased manner that you know what the outcome of that survey is going to be. So the NRA puts that survey out and finds out that 98% of respondents support President Bush. Now, the NRA can use that then and advertise and put a political ad out saying 98% of Americans support President Bush. So that's one usage of a push poll, is to create a survey that brings an outcome that you want and then advertise that survey as if it's a normal survey in an effort to convince the public that your opinions are correct. The second way a push poll works is they are not even collecting the data for that survey, because they already know that 85% of their respondents are going to respond the way they want it to. What they're doing is they're trying to persuade their audience by their question. I remember receiving a phone call from a political opinion survey once, and the question was, are you aware that candidate so-and-so has been indicted for child molestation? And you'd say, no. And then they say, well, knowing that, would you support candidate X? Again, that's not a survey to gauge opinion. What it is it's using a survey as a vehicle to try to change opinions, to try to communicate the campaign's message. So, push polls are notorious for manipulating question wording and intentionally introducing bias into a survey. Now, if you're constructing a survey to find out what public opinion is, then you need to be careful that you don't make that same mistake. The final source for bias in a survey is question order. And this is an interesting situation where the interviewer effect can be solid, the question wording can be carefully gauged, but the order in which you ask the questions can alter the outcome of the surveys. Now, as an example, I remember during the Bill Clinton impeachment trial, and if you don't know the details, Bill Clinton was accused of engaging in an affair with an intern, and he had testified at a trial that he had not had any affairs, and so that meant he was guilty of perjury. And the House of Representatives had a debate on whether or not to impeach the president on this, based on this perjury charge. Now, in the midst of this high political drama of the Clinton impeachment trial, CBS issued a opinion survey that indicated that Bill Clinton had one of the highest approval ratings of any post-war president. And I remember when I heard that thinking, well, that's odd, because he sure is getting a lot of negative press with this whole Lewinsky impeachment trial thing. How could he be getting the highest approval ratings of any modern president? And so I looked at the survey. It was a CBS New York Times survey, and it was available online. So I looked through it. The sample frame was good. It was plus or minus 2.5%. Okay, check. The representative sample is good. I looked at interviewer effect. It was a phone survey by the professionals. The major media outlets know about these things, and so they were professionals about it, so that was fine. I read through the questions that were asked, and none of them seemed to be slanting the respondents in any given way, so question wording looked fine. But then I noticed the question order, and here was the order that this survey went. It started out saying, how are you doing economically? And this trial occurred during the late 1990s when the economy was going gangbusters. Everyone was doing great. It said, has your economic situation improved over the last 4 years? Essentially asked that question that Ronald Reagan asked. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And most people in America, the answer was yes, because things were going quite well. It then said, do you think the economy as a whole is doing well? When, again, you'd have to be in a cave to answer no to that question. And so after a series of these economic questions about how wonderful the country was doing, it then asked, do you think that President Clinton is doing a good job directing the country? And a lot of people voted yes on that. And then the very next question after the popularity question was, have you been following the impeachment trial? And so I guarantee that had they started the survey talking about the impeachment trial, and have you been following the trial, do you think the House should vote to impeach, etc., and then asked the popularity question, they would have gotten a much lower number. It still might have been positive, but it would have not have been a record high positive as they reported. So it's important to look at question order, particularly as a consumer of surveys. You want to look at those things to make sure that the opinions that are being reported are actually valid. Now, as you do this, as you look at question order, interviewer effects, question wording, and a random representative sample, you will have a better sense of what surveys to accept and what surveys to reject. For example, any survey that's done on TV or the internet is by definition an invalid survey, because those surveys, people call in or click a button to answer those surveys, which means the respondents are self-selecting whether or not to respond to the survey, which means it cannot be a random or representative sample. So that's a good caveat when you hear some crazy news story about how Americans believe something that just doesn't gel with what you think they believe. You can look at that survey and see, and what you'll see 9 times out of 10 is the really crazy surveys that are reported are coming from some internet site or a phone program where people called in, like an American Idol or something. That's not random or representative. So, as you pay attention to these things, you can be a better consumer of public opinion data, and also you could construct your own surveys correctly. Now, as an aside, this is a growth industry. Industry, entertainment, politics, everybody needs to know what Americans are thinking and what their opinions are. And so if you can learn how to do this, you can actually make quite a good living at it. Now that we know what opinions are and how they're measured, the next question to ask is, where do these opinions come from? How do people formulate these opinions? And how does that formulation affect their political opinions as well as their political actions? Now, when we're talking about the formation of opinions, we're talking about socialization, how people adopt their values and attitudes. And the definition of political socialization, as it says in the slide, is it is the process by which people adopt the norms, values, attitudes, and behaviors of the prevailing political culture. A key point to discuss here is that the word process, it is a process that we go through to acquire these values and attitudes. Our socialization are the attitudes we have towards the world and towards our own behavior are not simply handed to us or created in a coherent package. They're gradually formed over time in this process of socialization. The other part of that definition to pay attention to is the notion of the prevailing political culture. This means that the culture that you are surrounded by has a huge impact on you and the belief system that you enjoy. So the picture on the slide of the military parade with the children following the parents and the flag waving, and you'll notice the little boy in a military uniform. These are all powerful indicators that these children in the slide are having their values and attitudes towards the country, and their sense of patriotism is being developed in this activity that is engaged in. Even the adults that are walking along in this parade are having their patriotic values, their sense of normalcy is being reinforced by being in this group of other like-minded people. So whatever the prevailing political culture is the norm to which people adapt to. And as you move from one political culture to the next, say a refugee comes from a foreign culture that is alien in many regards and comes to America, their values, attitudes, and norms will likely undergo a shift as they adopt those of their new adopted homelands' political prevailing culture. So it is this process of socialization that we want to look at here. The literature on socialization in the political psychology or social psychology fields indicate that most of our values and attitudes are developed quite early in age, and that the pre-adult experience is a formative experience in the norms, values, and attitudes that we carry with us into the adult world. Children are not simply sponges, but they're very sponge-like in the way that they learn about the world around them, and they adopt the patterns of the world around them. And so, speaking specifically about political socialization, we see that by an early age, children can understand the difference between a political and a non-political job. So, for example, a grocery store owner or a doctor, the children understand there's a distinction between those types of jobs and a policeman or a fireman or a teacher or a politician. They understand that some jobs are private and other jobs are public, and they're public servants, and they can distinguish between those types of employment. They get that. They understand it. By third grade, kids understand their party preferences. This is one reason why kids voting in Arizona, that program frequently will accurately predict the outcome of the election that's being held that night. And that's because kids know whether they're Republicans or Democrats. Now, they don't understand what those terms mean, but they know that that's what they're supposed to be. And it's no surprise that kids will mirror the party preference of their parents. Now, if it's a split family, say the mom is one party and the dad is another, in those cases, the child tends to adopt the party preference of whichever parent they spend the most time with. Typically, it's the mother at this early age. So, if you ask a kid on a playground, they will have an opinion on the president and on their congressman, even though they have no idea really of what those people do or what the meaning of the words are that they're using. Now, kids tend to see an idealized picture of government. They can't explain checks and balances or understand the legislative process or any of the concepts that we're talking about here in this college course, but they nevertheless have a good sense of what the government is, and they have a very idealistic picture of the government. So when they're talking about crime or the police, their image is that of McGruff the crime dog, who is telling them to say no to drugs. And they know that the policemen and the firemen that come to their schools are there to protect them and help them. Now again, that's the prevailing political culture. I have a friend who's a police officer, and some of the neighborhoods he walks through, the children come up and try to spit on him, because in their surroundings, in their prevailing political culture, the police are seen as the enemy, the bad guys, and that's the environment in which they're being raised, and so they adopt those same attitudes towards the government and the political structures. So children are quite malleable, and this is why it's another reason why the government has an interest in maintaining stable home structures. It's because it's within those home structures that the values of citizenship are either developed or not developed. Well, let's look closer at the process of that development. How does socialization occur? Now, the social psychologists argue that there are two different types of socialization, two different categories of agents of socialization. One are the passive agents, meaning it's a view of socialization where people are in an environment, will adopt that environment around them. It views the subjects of socialization in a passive sense, kind of like a sponge. If you take a neutral sponge and put it in blue water, the sponge will absorb the blue water and become blue. But if you take it out and wring out that blue water and stick it in red water, the sponge will absorb the red water and become red. So that's an analogy of the passive view of socialization, that kids are recipients of culture, that they absorb the culture that is around them, and that is the process by which they're socialized. Now there's another view of socialization, which is a more active view. And that argues that people aren't sponges. They don't simply adapt the environmental norms that surround them. Instead, they interact with their environment. And so the socialization that results from that interaction is a combination of whatever values and norms that you intrinsically hold in you and the values and norms of the society around you. And so your socialization then is a cross between what you're told and what you experience, because that experience is the most important factor in your socialization. So we will now look at different agents of socialization within both of these models. We'll look at the passive agents first. The first agent of socialization, the first passive agent, are parents. And parents are probably the most important agents of socialization in a child's life. And if you look at your own values and attitudes and norms that are accepted and think about the origin of those values and attitudes and norms, probably most of those stem from the influence of your parents. Parents are powerful agents because they spend so much time with children during their most formative years, as children are beginning to understand the world around them, as they learn language, they adopt the accents of that language. That's a good analogy for how they adopt the values of their parents as well. The way you adopt the accent of your language is as you're learning what language is, what sounds mean, how sounds are put together in order to communicate with those around you, you mirror and you mimic those sounds and those patterns of sounds. And it's in that language acquisition process you adopt the accent or regional dialect that is surrounding you. And you think that's normal. You think that's what everybody speaks like. And it's only after you leave that region and interact with people who speak with a different dialect that you realize that your language acquisition might not look like everyone else's language acquisition. Well, similarly, the values and attitudes that you adopt of what the world means and how to interact with the world, and in particular your political values and attitudes, are perceived as what is normal and what everybody believes and the way people just are. And it's not until you're older and you begin to interact with others that you may come to realize that the values and attitudes of your parents are a particular subset of values and attitudes. So that early childhood socialization is vital to the development of children's socialization. This is why parents who are politically active, who vote regularly, who discuss issues at the dinner table, tend to raise children who, as grown-ups, become politically active, vote regularly, and are knowledgeable on political issues. Conversely, parents who are not politically active, they don't vote, they are disparaging of the politics around them and are disengaged from politics, raise children who tend to not vote, not participate, and are distrustful and disparaging of the political attitudes around them. Now, we don't want to overstate the case because people are not robots, but by and large, that socialization that is done in early childhood persists. This, again, is a reason why the community has a stake in how parents parent and how that socialization occurs, particularly in the development of the democratic norms of civic virtue and participation. The next passive agent of socialization is the schools. As children grow and mature, they enter the school system, and it is here that usually they're first introduced to other individuals, other schoolmates who have been raised in different families with perhaps different norms and different attitudes, and the student has to come to terms with perhaps the disconnect between their home upbringing and those of the people around them. Schools are also quite explicit in their effort to socialize kids, to develop civic attitudes. At the beginning of each day, there's a recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance. Perhaps part of the Declaration of Independence is read to the children. They're taught about the society around them. They're taught things like how to stand in line, how to raise your hand before you speak, how to interact with others in nice ways. The bullies get punished if they're caught. There are explicit norms of conformity and acceptance of authority that are taught in the schools. Now, it's important to note here that schools try very hard to not instill partisan values because they get in trouble, quite a bit of trouble, if they're caught doing that. And so they don't tell children about why they should be good Republicans or why they should be good Democrats. Instead, the socialization tends to be pro-establishment, how to fit in with society and not make waves. Now, there's quite a bit of controversy surrounding the types of socialization that occurs in schools, and that's because parents are leery. They're distrustful of handing their children over to these state institutions where they might be exposed to values, norms, and attitudes that differ from those that the parents hold. One thing to remember in this, though, is that the schools tend to accurately reflect the values and norms of the surrounding community. It's very rare that a school is out of step with the values and norms of the parents who send their children to the school. The main reason for this is because the curriculum is determined by the school board, and the school board are elected officials. And so schools tend not to be very far out of step with their local communities, because if they are, the school board will lose the next election, and so they try to stay in step with that. So schools in, say, San Francisco will have a different curriculum than a school in Arkansas. Those schools would have a different set of norms and values that are passed on to the children. But those norms and values would reflect the community that the school is located in. So the fear that schools are pursuing some kind of agenda that is at odds with that of the community, there isn't a lot of data to support those fears. By and large, schools reflect the ideology of their local community. Now, having said that, the schools are the most powerful agents of socialization that the state has at its disposal. The government, the set of institutions that are public, express that socialization through schools. And so they are powerful agents, combined with the fact that they interact with children at that young age when they are most impressionable. So after the parents, schools are some of the most powerful agents of socialization. Now, as children grow and mature, another set of agents comes into play, and that is the peer group. Peers begin to, displace is probably too strong of a word, but they begin to compete with parents and schools for having a profound impact on socialization. As children enter their adolescent years, peers become more and more important. And occasionally those peer groupings will conflict with the school agents or the parent agents, particularly as adolescents go through a normal rebellious stage as the sense of self begins to grow and differentiate from that of child to adult. One thing about the peer socialization, though, is that even though children who are going through this stage try to rebel or adopt values that are perhaps different from those of their parents in this effort to establish an adult self distinct from the child self, the values and attitudes that people adopt in this process are actually conformist. They tend to adopt the values and attitudes of their friends around them. So just as the slideshow, we've got the child with the mohawk trying to make a bold statement of rebellion against the norms of the parents and schools, and yet that mohawk looks identical to the mohawk being sported by his friend. So in the very act of rebellion, they're engaging in conformity. They are going through a process of socialization where they're adopting the norms, values, and attitudes of their peer group. We can also see the same pattern when people get tattoos or they take body piercings. They tend to get the same tattoos and the same body piercings of their peer group. They are conforming in their act of nonconformity. Another indication that these peer groupings are not as radical or nonconforming as they may appear to be is that if you look at the parents of your friends and as a teenager, what is often the case is that the parents of your friends are from the same socioeconomic, racial, religious background as your parents are, meaning that early socialization that takes place from parents and schools still is influencing the very selection of your peer group. And now, teenagers don't like to hear this because they think they're rebelling against their parents, but the fact that their peer group, which is a rebelling peer group, looks identical to the peer group of their parents indicates that peer socialization, while important, perhaps is subsidiary to the underlying socialization that has already occurred. Now, another point to make, though, on this notion of peer socialization is that it is important who our friends are, because those peers do have an impact. As a college student, if I can take a minute here and give a pitch for peer groups, one reason people who go to college are more successful and have a higher income than people who don't go to college is because in college they form a peer group that leads to attitudes, norms, and values that lead to success in the marketplace. It is important as you're going to college to take advantage of this peer group that you are surrounded by. Some people call it networking, other people might call it socializing, but it's an important asset to you as a college student to reach out and make connections and form a peer group with those who are also attending college, because the impact that that peer group will have on you is going to be different than the peer group that you might have in your neighborhood of people who are not going to college. They're going to have a different impact, and that collegial peer group will have a benefit to you throughout your life, particularly as those peers go on and become successful and form careers. Those connections are going to continue to be useful to you throughout your life. So usually at this point I like to make the argument for forming a peer group in college. Don't just drive to school, go to your classes, get in your car, and drive back home. It's worth your time to create a peer group of your your college colleagues. Now, parents, schools, and peers are the three most powerful agents of socialization in a passive sense, but they're not the only ones. There are other agents of socialization that explicitly try to instill a set of norms and values and attitudes. And as you surround yourself by the prevailing political culture, it may shift from one institution to the next. So, for example, a church is all about instilling norms, values, and attitudes. And so as you attend a particular denomination of a church, you will adopt a set of norms and values that are different than if you were to attend a different denomination. Likewise, the military is a very powerful socialization agent for the members of the military. They have a much less of an impact on the culture at large, but basic training in the military is all about stripping the recruit of their existing norms, values, and attitudes, and giving them a new set of norms, values, and attitudes that are appropriate for a military environment. And as people come out of the military, they tend to have a difficult or jarring experience when they come out of that military culture and re-engage the dominant culture, the civilian culture, because they have to then re-adopt the norms, values, and attitudes of the civilian culture. Now, there's lots of debate on the impact of the media and how it affects socialization. The social psychology literature suggests that the media does not have that big of an influence on our socialization. It is less important as these other agents of parents, schools, and peer groups. However, it cannot be discounted. It does have an impact. And the primary role that the media plays in our socialization is not to tell us what to think, what values to adopt, but rather what to think about. The media has a tremendous agenda-setting role. And so what we discuss and what topics we debate are often driven by the media. Now, our opinions on those topics and what positions we take in those debates tend to come from other sources of socialization, not the media. But the agenda-setting power should not be underestimated. That is a quite powerful influence on the prevailing political culture. One last example of passive socialization would be someone who goes to prison, for example. In prison, the norms, values, and attitudes that you have to adopt to survive are very different from the norms, values, and attitudes that you might have outside of prison. And this is one reason why people who have spent time in prison, they come out of that experience changed and have a difficult time reassociating into normal civilian life is because their values and attitudes have changed as a result of being immersed in that very different and unique prevailing political culture. And so these are all examples of passive socialization, that as people move from one social environment to the next, they will adopt the prevailing norms of that social culture, and that affects political viewpoints and political behaviors. Let's shift focus now to the active agents of socialization. Now remember, the passive view is that people are sponges, whereas the active view are that the socialization that occurs is a function of the interaction of people with their environment, with the prevailing political culture. And one theory of active socialization is the life cycle explanation, that people's socialization and their susceptibility to passive socialization alters as they go through life. So at an early age with children, again, they're quite impressionable because they are trying to make sense of the world around them. Their brain is developing at enormous rates, and they really are, to a large degree, sponges that just soak in the world around them. So that makes children very impressionable, very subject to the passive agents of socialization. Likewise, when in adolescence and youth, as we begin to navigate the adult world and develop our sense of self away from a child that is dependent on those around them to become a unique individual that is independent of those around them, that process through adolescence where our identity changes in that way, that also is a very impressionable time as we create the person that we're going to be as an adult. However, once we hit around 30, the social psychology literature indicates that at 30, the frontal lobe is fully developed. Our cognitive abilities are pretty much set, and our socialization sort of cements in around 30. There are very infrequent sort of conversion experiences that occur in people after 30. Their views tend to solidify. They're set in stone. And once someone is past 30, you can take them from their prevailing political culture and put them in a new political culture, and they will resist that culture. They will tend to maintain their viewpoints, their attitudes, their values, even when it's at odds with the culture that is around them. And that is because they are resistant to the passive socialization. That doesn't mean that it doesn't occur, that people don't change. People are still subject to passive socialization, but it is to a much lesser degree as an adult than they are as a child. Now, the last point to make here is that our cognitive ability begins to decline with age, and we again become more susceptible to socialization, and our viewpoints and our attitudes begin to shift again as people become aged and begin to decline in their physical and cognitive health and ability. This is one reason why our society puts the elderly and the infirm in a protected class, a protected category. So a crime, for example, that is committed against an elderly person is viewed as being committed against someone who is vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Now, the reason that we have those legal structures put in place is it's a recognition that vulnerability develops because of this decline in cognitive and physical abilities as we age. So this notion that our socialization varies as we go through life is a life cycle explanation of socialization. Another explanation of active socialization is a pivotal event explanation. And what this theory is arguing is that there are key episodes in our life that have such a deep impact on our experience that our values, norms, and attitudes shift as a result of that formative event that occurs. That the event changes us. We come out of that event different than before we went into that event. Now, of course, there's a whole industry built on leadership boot camps to try to artificially create such a formative event. So this notion is probably not completely foreign to you. But for example, people who grew up in the Depression have a very different set of attitudes and beliefs than people who grew up during the post-World War II boom years. I recall my own grandmother, who was a girl during the Great Depression, and she was, by all regards, a fairly savvy financial person. She had investments, she had properties, and she understood financial institutions. And yet she informed her family that when she died, nobody was allowed to throw anything away. And it wasn't because she was a pack rat, although that's another common trait for people who grew up in the Depression. They don't throw anything away. But the reason was because she had small bills stashed throughout her house. You would pull a book down from the shelf and there'd be a $10 bill in the middle of the book. And she did this because even though she had all these financial holdings, she never really trusted the financial institutions. And that's because as a girl, her parents had all their money in a savings account, and the bank just failed. The bank disappeared overnight, and their parents lost everything that they had. And so she always had some cash hidden around in rather bizarre places. And it's because that value, that belief that she had, that the entire modern financial institution were fragile. Another example would be, as a slide showing the Vietnam War, the baby boomers that had their formative experience during that conflict. My colleagues that I work with at work, they tend not to trust government. They tend not to believe things when the government tells them. And that is because in their formative period, it was one of protesting or being lied to by government entities. Many college students now had a formative experience with the September 11th attacks. For many college students, those attacks occurred when they were teens or younger. And their view of what the world is and how to behave in the world was affected by that and by the angst and general sense of unease and danger that was introduced to the American political culture after those attacks. So these are all examples of how a pivotal event can alter who you are and the political viewpoints that you have and the norms, values, and attitudes that you carry with you as you move on in your life. And that as that pivotal event occurs to lots of people, to the culture, then that also creates a shared history that alters the political culture. So this is another agent of socialization. At this point, it's useful to ask, who cares? This notion of socialization and all of the social psychology that I've been sharing with you about passive agents and active agents, it's all very interesting, but how does it impact politics? And how does it impact our political system? Well, the impact can happen in a couple of different ways. Some people argue for the primacy principle. And as the slide indicates, that means what you learn first lasts longest. It has the most importance attached to it. Now, in accordance with the primacy principle then, the early socialization that you have as a child, with schools, with peers, or maybe a pivotal event that occurs early, the values and attitudes that you acquire as a result of that socialization form a bedrock foundation upon which you rely the rest of your life. And even if you might have other beliefs put on top of that, maybe as an adult you change your mind about some views, you alter your socialization, maybe you move into a different political culture and you modify your viewpoints. The primacy principle argues that those early values and attitudes are still sort of lurking back there, waiting in the wings. And when a situation happens where you're threatened or you're endangered or a jarring episode happens and maybe you're called into question your values and attitudes, what the primacy principle would suggest that in those moments of doubt or threat, you go back to those early principles that you had, that they're primary, they're more important than whatever other values and attitudes were placed on top of that. This might explain why some people who appear to be quite tolerant of others can lash out in an intolerant way when they're threatened. Maybe they're unemployed, or maybe they're in a dark alleyway, and those early notions that maybe they've thought they'd put aside that perhaps might even be completely irrational jump out of that, the back of your mind. So that's the primacy principle, that what you learn as an early child is the strongest values and beliefs that you have, and they're very difficult to overcome as an adult if you decide they need to be overcome. The second argument is the structuring principle. And the structuring principle says it's not that these early values and beliefs are more powerful than the later values and beliefs that you may adopt. Instead, it's that these early values and beliefs form a foundation upon which the subsequent values and attitudes are built. And so they structure what those values and attitudes will be. And now this suggests, again, that it's not that your primary socialization is lurking in the background ready to jump out at a moment of threat or peril, but rather that the beliefs and attitudes you have today are built upon the beliefs and attitudes you had earlier, that you don't go too far afield from that early socialization. So to use a perhaps silly analogy, if you are building a building with a square foundation, it's difficult to then have a round building built on a foundation that is square, or vice versa. If you have a round foundation, the odds are you're not going to build a square building on top of that round foundation. Round foundations tend to build round buildings, and square foundations tend to lead to the construction of a square building. So that perhaps is overly simplistic, but it illustrates this other argument for why socialization matters, is that it structures the viewpoints. It perhaps is a lens through which the subsequent attitudes and beliefs have to go through before they can have an impact on you. Now, it's important in all this discussion about socialization, and particularly in the development of political opinions and attitudes, is to remember that people are not robots. They're not sponges. We don't enter life with a program, with a predetermined set of actions that we're going to engage in. People make choices, and they choose which actions to engage in. We all know people that are good kids that come from really terrible families, and we all know really terrible kids that come from really good families. That socialization process is not seamless. There are all sorts of factors that can interplay with or interfere with the socialization process to mold a person into who they are. And people have a say in that molding process. They choose to become the kind of person they are. Now, the socialization has a tremendous impact, but nevertheless, people do exercise their moral agency to make choices of which values, which attitudes, which behaviors to engage in. And that may be in opposition to those of the prevailing political culture. So it's important to remember that caveat in this discussion, that socialization is critical to understand when we're trying to understand people's political attitudes and behaviors, but it is not deterministic. In this presentation, we've looked at where opinions come from, how they're measured, and the impact those opinions have on our own actions. Now, as we understand our own behavior and the behavior of those around us, it becomes easier to understand why people behave the way that they do, why they come to the decisions that they do, what their motives are. And once we understand those things, or at least have a model in which to guess at those things, then the outcomes of political contests can become a little more predictable. Now, in the next presentation, we will look at how people of similar viewpoints and similar opinions get together to be more effective in their political action. This presentation is courtesy of Brian Dille. I'm the speaker, and I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College, a college of the Maricopa Community College District in Mesa, Arizona. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.